Jens Stoltenberg, who's the NATO Secretary General, recently went to Washington, D.C., and he had this press conference, as you can see on screen, with Anthony Blinken. We're not going to watch the whole thing. The whole thing's like 44 minutes long. But the general premise of the press conference and the general premise of the trip that Jens Stoltenberg made to the United States as, you know, the head NATO official, the head official of the alliance, was to come over to America to make the case for Ukraine aid. What Jens Stoltenberg came over here and did, if you listen to him, we can listen to a little bit to at least his opening to see what he's talking about, is he wanted to come over here and deal with the gridlock. That aid for Ukraine has been choked up since October, and now the Republicans in the House and Mike Johnson leading them seem set to sink the immigration Ukraine deal that they asked for and requested in order to pass Ukraine aid in the first place, to please the same Republicans who wanted it to be tied to Ukraine aid in the first place. So it's a huge mess. It's been blocked since October. We're now going into February and we still don't have a deal done. And so we've had a few foreign officials come over, but it's been getting more intensive. While before we had Zelensky come over, and now he's stopped visiting because apparently the signal was sent to him that his visits aren't going to help push the aid anymore. And in some circles, it might actually just anger people more. So he's not making visits specifically to advocate for that anymore. So instead, other European officials have come. For example, the former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Liz Truss, came over to the United States like a month ago in order to try to make the case to Republicans that Ukraine aid matters. And since she's from the Conservative Party, she thought she maybe could make a dent. I immediately thought after seeing Liz Truss go over there is hopefully now they'll actually get some sort of popular conservative from the United Kingdom, wherever those might be, because we are in the time of Rishi Sunak. But for the Americans, it could be, for the American conservatives, just send over Boris Johnson. Unironically. Look, I don't like Boris Johnson, but if Boris Johnson came over here and was like, and did one of his, like, I don't know, cracked a few racist jokes with Mike Johnson and then was like, and like, I think he could maybe convince him. Plus, American conservatives have some respect for Boris, but who knows? He hasn't made the trip yet, but he is a big supporter of Ukraine. But now we have Jens Stoltenberg coming over making the same case to Republicans, to Americans, saying that this aid cannot be held up any longer and that the holding up of aid is actually having an impact on the battlefield, which it is. I can tell that from reporting I've seen from other outlets, and I can tell that just from personal conversations that I have semi-frequently with soldiers who are telling me that they have a massive artillery shortage. I've seen units documented by press having to resort to using smoke shells like cannonballs because they just don't have enough shells. And it's better to have a shell, even if it's a smoke shell, and fire that at enemy positions and hope that turns back a Russian offensive than have no shells. They're trying to make up the deficit with drones. They're trying to make up the deficit with other types of munitions. Drones being the main munition that they're relying upon more and more as they try to preserve every shell they have, as the 155 and 152 millimeter shell crisis continues to starve Ukrainian soldiers. Now, that's why he's here, because it's no longer a question of just, okay, we have time for bipartisan compromise. The Ukrainians needed this aid to be agreed to months ago. Whenever the agreement is made, it is not going to immediately be signed, and then all the aid just shows up on the front line. It's going to take months when they finally agree to this aid package to actually get the weapons over to Europe, to then send them through Poland, to get into Lviv, to then travel to Kiev, to then go into storage units, to then be taken out of storage units, and they'll probably be taken out of storage units very quickly. This is part of the reason why it's very difficult to track a lot of the weapons in Ukraine, because anytime new weapons arrive, a lot of the people who are in charge of doing that, by the time they get to the actual storage units in like 2 or 3 days, it's already been sent to the front because the shortage is so bad and they just don't have that much reserves. So the problem right now is not great. The problem right now is not great. They have a shortage. And even when we finally solve this problem, quote unquote, and it's not going to be solving the problem because in the future, we're going to still have to approve more aid packages, and we don't want to have to deal with this type of hostage crisis every time. It's why the Europeans don't want to give Viktor Orban the ability to veto aid to Ukraine every year, even though he keeps requesting it in order to approve aid. It's because they don't want this crisis every year. They want to show the Ukrainians that stability in the alliance exists while supporting them. So they're not going to get the aid any like in the immediate future, and they won't get the aid even after they approve it for probably a month or two. So it's going to take time for this to have a real impact. When the aid is approved, the Ukrainians can start planning into the future because they'll have some idea of the type of support they're going to get from their allies who promised them in the 90s after they gave up their nuclear weapons that we would support them. And so Jens Stoltenberg, seeing that there's not much progress on getting a Ukraine aid deal, felt compelled to come to the United States and make this case so he could show that this isn't a partisan politics from Biden. This is the alliance that is at risk here. And if the United States does not support Ukraine, it'll have devastating consequences for Europe, European stability, for the Ukrainians, for American credibility, for deterrence, for non-nuclear proliferation, for all sorts of things. Anyway, let's listen a little bit to what Jens Stoltenberg had to say before I show you the other officials who are going to complain to Mike Johnson.
For the weeks and months ahead as we prepare for NATO summit. Jens, over to you.
Thanks so much, Secretary Blinken there, Tony. Thank you for hosting me here in Washington. It is always good to meet with you, and even more important given the dangers we face. So let me begin by offering my deepest condolences for the US troops killed and wounded in yesterday's drone attack in Jordan. We see Iran continue to
Dude, Ukraine followed us into Iraq, sent troops with us to look for weapons of mass destruction that never manifested. And now that the Russians are invading them to look for nuclear weapons that never manifested, the chemical bioweapons targeting Russian DNA, seems like it's a lot quicker for us to jump ship than them. Just saying. By the way, they didn't just join us in Iraq. They also joined us in Afghanistan. And the only time I've seen that brought up, the fact that the Ukrainians join us in these wars, isn't by Americans who are thankful that even when we went into these gallivanting throughout the Middle East in a way that was damaging both to our own interests, to the stability in the region, etc. Now, the only time I see that brought up is by, like, tankies who are angry that they helped us invade Iraq, which, I mean, I can understand that, but it's kind of weird how quickly we held them when they were helping us, but now, oh, they need help? It just feels so slimy. We take their nukes, we take their soldiers for our wars, and then when they're in a period of trouble, we kind of stand on the sideline for 8 years before it becomes too hard to ignore. Then we intervene. And then 2 years into it, at a cost of 0.2 to 0.3% of the American budget, which we haven't spent since October, by the way. Now that's too much. Now we have Ukraine fatigue. Americans are scared of sitting on their couch and watching other people blow up on their TVs. I mean, come on.
Stabilize the region. Iran also bears responsibility for backing terrorists.
Let me just throw that out there, that Ukrainians put their troops in harm's way to go into Iraq and Afghanistan. We haven't even done that for Ukraine, but we're the ones with fatigue. Did you hear about Iraq fatigue from the Ukrainians? Afghanistan fatigue from the Ukrainians? I'm just saying, it doesn't look like we're behaving like a good ally would.
Who attack ships in the Red Sea. Tehran's behavior reminds us of what a world without rules look like. Unpredictable and dangerous, a world where our security becomes more expensive. I welcome your tireless
By the way, I do want to bring this up because somebody in Gutter Chat mentioned it, and this is true. 18 Ukrainians did die in Iraq. Not a single American has died in Iraq in American uniform. I mean in Ukraine. The only Americans that are dying in Ukraine are ones that, you know, saw what was going on in Ukraine and were so horrified that they went over there to volunteer themselves. Many of them, I know them. But again, it feels so slimy.
Diplomacy, Secretary Blinken, to prevent further escalation of the war in Gaza. Your efforts to alleviate human suffering and your hard work towards a peaceful resolution. Russia's brutal war against Ukraine is nearing the 2-year mark, and a Russian victory would embolden Iran, North Korea, and China.
Also, I want to give credit to these guys outside of DC. These guys, and that guy on the right there, he's outside of DC basically every single day. They are outside DC calling for aid every single day. I've said to myself, before I go back to Ukraine, I gotta go to DC and just spend a day standing with them outside, holding a flag, holding a sign. I'll feel like a monster if I don't.
That matters for Europe's security, and it matters for America's security. So supporting Ukraine serves US interests. For a tiny fraction of annual defense spending, the United States has helped Ukraine destroy a major part of Russia's combat capacity without placing a single American soldier in harm's way. I welcome the clear...
It's just crazy how quick Republicans are to support Israel in the Middle East, despite, as a direct result of that, American soldiers in uniform are dying. But that's a cost we're willing to pay. But when it comes to like 0.3 to 4% of the defense budget, the Pentagon budget, that isn't a price we're willing to pay. After they paid, some of their guys paid the ultimate price for our gallivanting throughout the region, it's just so slimy.
Commitment from President Biden and you to sustain US support to Ukraine and to work with Congress to achieve that.
Oh, guys, I'm sorry. Ukraine will be a forever war, unlike the struggle between Israel and the Palestinians, which will end tomorrow.
As you said, other allies are also stepping up. In fact, what European NATO allies and Canada provide in terms of military, financial and humanitarian aid actually exceeds what the US is providing. So this is truly a joint effort by all NATO allies from both sides of the Atlantic. And I'm confident that all NATO allies will continue to deliver, because supporting Ukraine is not charity. It is an investment in our own security. President Putin started this war, and he could end it today if he stopped attacking a neighbor.
So I'm just going to go up to the 10-minute mark. I'm going to let him do his opening statement just to give you the general theme of his speech. But isn't this embarrassing? As an American, I feel embarrassed that this guy felt compelled due to the fact that we're not pulling our weight anymore. And people talk about, well, I don't want to give them until the Europeans give more. According to the Kiel Institute, if we talk about multi-year aid that has already been approved, that means aid that has been approved and has been approved into the future. Europe has already approved that. They have approved more financial aid than we have. While we, on the large part, and I think this is because of our capacity to provide it more than the Europeans, we've been more providing military aid, even though in this next package, we are going to be providing some financial aid as well so the government can stay afloat under immense pressure. But isn't this embarrassing that he felt compelled to come over here, even though we all know that if there was a Ukraine vote alone, the majority of congressmen, the majority of senators, and the president support it. And now we're getting to the point where Mitch McConnell and others are saying, and even Mike Johnson is saying, and we're going to talk about that in a second, that they might separate the two, immigration and Ukraine aid, which would mean that we're just doing what we originally wanted to do back in October before Republicans pinned immigration to it. What type of cosmic horror comedy are we? It's embarrassing as an American to explain that type of political dynamic to anybody who doesn't live here, or to have somebody like this come over and try to get over that political dynamic by emphasizing how important it is to us, how important it is to Europe. I mean, Europe's our main export market, man. A lot of us, we like to pretend that America's isolated. The reason why America is so wealthy compared to many parts of the world is because of our international markets, is because of globalism, is because of trade. You think of the 1950s and you're like, oh, that's the greatest time in American history. Let's go back to that. Not this nonsense today. Where do you think we were selling off fucking products? It was Europe. What do you think of the Marshall Plan? What do you think the purpose of that was? I think some people overemphasize the amount of economic impact and recovery the Marshall Plan had. A lot of the recovery had already happened by the time the Marshall Plan had been implemented. But the vote in confidence in the political effects to help with stabilization, to help embed ourselves with them deeper, has led to a deep, beneficial economic and geostrategic and defensive relationship with the Europeans that have benefited both of us. And whether you think it hasn't benefited the Americans as much, well, they joined us in our gallivanting throughout the Middle East. The only time Article 5 has ever been triggered, ever, has been by the United States. And it was triggered after 9/11. And then they sent troops into the Middle East to get killed and die under the assumption that if one day Europe was threatened, we would come and help them.
The war could also end if Ukraine stopped defending itself. But that would not mean peace. It would mean Russian occupation, and occupation is not peace. A just peace will require President Putin to realize that he will not get what he wants on the battlefield. Moscow must accept a negotiated solution where Ukraine prevails as a sovereign, independent nation. What happens around the negotiating table?
I mean, I'm just imagining like Jens Stoltenberg or one of these European officials sitting down and having like someone say, well, do you know who Gonzalo Lira is, Mr. Stoltenberg? No, I do not know. Who's this Mr. Gonzalo Lira? Well, did you hear about these weapons getting to the cartels? Or Marjorie Taylor Greene stands up and she said this on TV. So this sounds like it's fake or I'm making up this statement. Well, I heard that organs were being harvested. Children's organs were being harvested by the Ukrainian government to pay for the war effort. What are you going to do to stop that? I would not be able to stand the war. I would not be able to stay in the same room if that type of interaction was happening. I get terrible secondhand embarrassment. I'll watch movies like Jackass, or I'll watch like Impractical Jokers, and at certain points, I literally have to walk out of the room. Same with Borat, because I just get such vicious secondhand embarrassment. I would get that's the impact it would have on me watching that type of an interaction.
Is inextricably linked to the situation on the battlefield. So if we want a lasting, just peace, we must provide Ukraine with more weapons and ammunition. Weapons to Ukraine is the path to peace.
Hey, my perspective on weapons to Ukraine has been pretty open, but I want to pitch something quick. No matter what scenario you want to end the war, in my mind, giving Ukraine the means to defend itself and leverage negotiations is going to help no matter what. If you want the Ukrainians to just win and kick out the Russians, which I think that would be the best scenario, then of course they're going to need more weapons. Well, if you want them to be able to negotiate and get the best deal possible, and that's what I hear from many of my contemporaries who scoff at the idea of sending military aid, I've got news for you. Okay, I don't know if I need you to go read some Thomas Schelling or what. Okay, I don't know what I'm going to have to tell you to learn the basics of negotiation. I don't know. But, and I'm not saying that as a big fan of Thomas Schelling. I'm just saying that because he understands at least this concept very well and explains it very well in his writings. If you are going to be negotiating with a power you're at war with, you need leverage. Because if you don't have leverage, you don't have anything. And the only type of leverage that I think the Russians are really going to respect here is the continued ability of the Ukrainians to blow up their boys as they invade their country. Because without that leverage, there'd be nothing stopping Putin, who has characterized his struggle as civilizational in nature, as in one civilizational structure, Russia, Belarus, and its allies, its Christianness, its holiness, its way of fighting against the degeneracy and the liberalism and the Americans against our civilization. That's the way they've painted it. Now, whether or not you want to engage in that struggle or you think it's stupid or whatever, that's the prescribed open position of the Russian government. What was the quote from Putin? Russia's borders end nowhere. I know that they're putting big posters of that everywhere. So if Ukraine runs out of ammunition, and Ukraine, even though like up to this point, that hadn't been a risk, because I had thought up till, late last year, that we wouldn't be stupid enough to legitimately just cut off aid. I could see maybe we'd be stupid enough to reduce aid and just let them kind of stay where they are. If we cut off aid and your job or your goal or your vision is they need to negotiate and get the best deal to end the violence, with no leverage, the Russians will continue, they'll take more, and it'll get even worse. And your desire for peace will become what? Death pits. Like they were in Bucha and like they were in other areas. And I'm not trying to be hyperbolic. I'm just being honest about the reality of the war. So my position is, even if you want Ukraine to negotiate as soon as possible, in order to get the best deal for their own security and to dissuade a future invasion, they're going to need the means to defend themselves, and they're going to need leverage. And what that means in this instance, artillery shells, artillery guns, tanks, and the ability to defend themselves, and the ability to make a point to the Russians that if they keep fighting, it will be worse for them.
Finally, we also discussed adapting our lines for the future. In July, we will mark NATO's 75th anniversary with a summit here in Washington. And as you said, NATO is getting stronger and bigger. Finland is already a member. Sweden will become a member soon. And this demonstrates that Putin is getting exactly the opposite of what he wanted. He wanted less NATO, a weaker NATO. He's getting a stronger and more united NATO, and NATO with more members. At the summit, we will take further steps to bolster NATO's strength.
What accent is this? Vague European.
Invest more in our defense and work with partners around the world. Through NATO, the US has more friends and allies than any other power. Together, we make up 50% of the world's economic and military might. China and Russia have nothing like NATO. It is why they always try to undermine our unity. In times of growing competition and rivalry, NATO makes the US stronger and safer, and all of us more secure. So Secretary Blinken, dear Tony, thank you again for your personal commitment to our transatlantic bond and to our shared security. Thank you.
Okay, I don't want to do the back and forth with the crowd, but I will tell you a few interesting. Well, I'll tell you one interesting moment that kind of surprised me. There was one moment where a journalist was like, "Well, what about making a deal? You know, how about you just like give them, you know, what they got?" And his answer was that occupation is not peace. It is not just about, you know, just freezing the line where it is. It's about finding a real peace, a lasting peace. And their occupied territory, they have a right to take back. So I will say that Jens Stoltenberg, when it comes to talking about occupied Ukrainian territory, has been more forceful than American officials. Just throwing that forward. Lastly, and we're not going to watch this interview. Originally, we were going to watch this interview with the NATO chief. Lastly, I want to throw out that isn't the only European official coming to the United States to try to convince American officials to support Ukraine. I've already talked about Liz Truss, and there have been other Europeans as well. But this time, we have the Estonians, the Latvians, the Lithuanians, the Baltic countries. Here's Mike Johnson tweeting out, "Today, I met with speakers of the Baltic states to discuss ongoing challenges that face our countries. We discussed the importance of deterring threats like China, Russia, and Iran. And we noted the importance of viable U.S. energy production to Baltics and the risk posed by the White House decision to pause LNG exports." Wow, is that all you talked about this specific? I'm sure in that conversation, they were like, while talking to Mike Johnson, "Oh my God, Mike, thank God we're with you. Oh, that silly Biden guy, he stopped those exports. We think you freezing that Ukraine aid is actually not all that important." I'm sure they talked about the LNG exports, and we'll probably do some episode or some video on LNG exports in the near future, since it's becoming a big story. But the point is, there's no way this was what dominated the conversation. What dominated the conversation was Ukraine. This word right here. This is what dominated the conversation. Because there's one person who can decide whether or not the Ukraine aid has a vote, and it's this guy, Mike Johnson. The Ukraine aid could have a majority support in the House, a majority support in the Senate, and the presidency. But if he, as House Speaker, does not bring it to the floor for a vote, there will not be a vote on it. There's no way, not every single person in this picture did not try to pressure him as much as possible or try to convince him that time is of the essence. Now, his response to this, I don't know what it says about how the meeting went or how he responded to it. It's very bland, very politician. But I still am doubtful that this man is going to choose American and European security interests over his own personal political career or the interests of his party. Because so far, he has failed to do so. And at the start of Mike Johnson's term, he talked about the importance of supporting Ukraine aid and how he would not stop Ukraine aid from going. He would allow Ukraine aid to go if we just dealt with a few issues. Then we kowtowed and tried to do everything the Republicans asked, even tying immigration reform, which is completely unrelated, to it, and agreeing to many things that Mitch McConnell and Lindsey Graham and Republican negotiators in the Senate asked for. And then it was sunk. And now, in effect, whether it was his intention or not, Ukraine aid has been blocked for months and months and months and months, and it's having an impact on the front line, and people are dying. And I'm not going to say that those people dying is Mike Johnson's specific fault, because, you know, war is a lot of chance. There's a lot of elements that lead to it. But I will say this. If Ukrainian positions in Avdiivka and Marinka and all these other locations had more shells to fire, it'd be harder for the Russians to take positions, it'd be harder for the Russians to storm trenches, and it'd be harder for the Russians to push. They'd take higher casualties, they'd lose more equipment, and it'd be harder for their soldiers to get to trenches with guns to shoot people. Just saying. Just saying. But this is embarrassing. This is embarrassing that this is necessary. Liz Truss, the Secretary General of NATO, Estonian, Latvian, and Lithuanian speakers, the president of Ukraine. Who else do we need to get out here? Who else do we need to bring to Europe? Do we do Rishi Sunak next? Then we try Boris? How about we wheel out the king? We just skip all of the regalia and get the real guy in charge. Anyway, we don't know much about this talk. A lot of it's rumor, but we do know one rumor that's out of it. Now, Mike Johnson does dispute some of this, but the rumor is that Mike Johnson told the group of speakers of these different countries that the plan is moving forward, because they were trying to be like, hey, are you going to make this deal on the border and get the Ukraine aid through? We've been waiting for so long. Where are you guys? You guys said you wouldn't do this. He says that they're going to probably cut the aid from border policy. It's going to split up, which would mean we're just doing what we asked for in October. Making the entirety of the last 5 months completely fucking pointless, to put it lightly. How beautiful. Hopefully, though, unironically, hopefully this is done sooner rather than later, because even if it's a type of dark comedy that we're just back to square one, they need the aid yesterday. So let's just get it through.